Hey there, Podcast Aquanauts. Okay, look, I know insects can be a bit of a trigger for some people, so before we begin, a quick disclaimer. Hopefully the episode title provided enough warning, but if you're squeamish about creepy crawlies, especially the thought of them on you or, in this case, in you, be forewarned that this upcoming discussion of eating insects may give you a case of the shivers. Don't worry though, even if you decide to resurface from this latest dive into the Podcast Aquatic prematurely, at least you'll walk away with the term entomophagy in your back pocket. Imagine dropping that at your next cocktail party, or even better, onto the triple word square on a Scrabble board. And if either of those scenarios comes true for those of you in the Podcast Aquanaut Corps, I'll consider it a win for science communication, so be sure to drop us a line and let us know how it played out. And also what score you got. Anyway, without further ado, on with the podcast. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Today, let's talk about bugs. And for today's special guest, I have invited Rose Segbers, our entomologist too. That's our bug expert. Rose, you have been here for a few years now.
Yep, I've been here very nearly 3 years, a few months shy of 3 years.
And in 3 years, I've never thought to ask you something, Rose. Have you ever eaten a bug?
I absolutely have. So in one of my entomology classes, we had a unit on entomophagy, which is just eating insects. And we actually had a chef come in and prepare a mealworm stir fry for us. And honestly, it was pretty good. It wasn't as bad as that you would expect it to be. It's like pork without the sliminess of pork.
Well, I mean, it's kind of in the name, right? It's a mealworm.
Exactly. It's meant to be fed. Well, it's meant to be fed to lizards, but it appears that we can eat them ourselves. Like, doesn't hurt us.
Yeah, we go through a lot of mealworms at the aquarium every year. I mean, tens of thousands. I think maybe hundreds of thousands. I have actually eaten an insect too. It was an exercise in politeness, shall we say. I was visiting a friend in Houston, and he invited us to a Mexican restaurant and very kindly ordered a plate of chapulinas for us to try, those are fried grasshoppers. It's a very common dish in Mexican cuisine. And my wife and I had an experience. It was interesting, and I'm glad I did it. But entomophagy that you mentioned earlier is not as uncommon as probably people here in the West, where we're a little more insect averse when it comes to our dining, might think it is. It's actually practiced all over the world. I've looked up did some research, for this episode, and found that 3,000 cultural groups in 113 countries practice entomophagy, eating 2,000 different species of insects. So it is nothing that's uncommon.
No, absolutely not.
Unless you're here.
Yes. In the West, it's kind of a taboo to eat insects. But, if you think about it, we eat crustaceans. We actually love eating crustaceans, shrimp, lobsters, that sort of thing. So really, insects isn't too far off, I don't think.
Yeah, they're just sea bugs.
Exactly.
So it kind of changes your perception of lobster if you think of it as just a sea insect.
A little bit, yeah.
But in fact, to go back and give a little bit of a history lesson, so lobsters, if you didn't know this, were once considered trash food. They were something that was found in such abundance that people would not eat them. And in fact, there were laws, I believe it was in Massachusetts, that dictated how much you were allowed to feed prisoners lobster every day. So perceptions obviously can change, and maybe that will be true of insects as well.
I mean, it certainly could be. Like, there are definitely people in the world that are pushing for that right now, just because it is such an abundant food source.
And one of the things that's happened recently that has us all, at least here in the Southeast, thinking about insects and their abundance is the emergence of brood 19 of the cicadas. So talk a little bit about what the emergence is and what we're experiencing here in the Southeast right now.
So if you live in an area with a fair amount of mature trees that are at least 13 years old, you might be seeing some very large periodical cicadas, big black bugs with red orangish eyes. Those guys emerge in massive numbers, meant to kind of overwhelm predators. And they do it all over the southeast. Really, there are broods like this all over the eastern half of the United States generally. We're actually having a 17-year brood emergence up in Illinois that's kind of overlapping with the brood emergence we're having right now. And that's been kind of a notable occurrence because we don't normally have this many cicadas emerging at once in the United States.
And you mentioned that we might be seeing them, but for a lot of people, it's not so much seeing them as it is hearing them.
Yeah.
So talk about the noise that these insects generate, because it's pretty spectacular.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So they have a mating call that kind of is that loud chirping sound that you hear. And like that's their primary goal as adults, is to just kind of mate, find a good place to lay their eggs. So they're doing a lot of mating calls right now. And when the insects are all gathered together in like large numbers on trees, you get a lot of screaming at one another. And that's what we're hearing right now.
I'm hoping to lay under some of the sound I recorded from down on our river walk, which is just behind the aquarium down by the Tennessee River. And the sound of these insects, if you're close to it, it's almost like a mechanical pulsation.
Yeah, it's kind of a deafening kind of, but not like quite as high pitched.
Yeah.
Kind of a crunchy noise a little bit.
And it comes in waves, and like the beating of an insect heart on a communal level.
Yeah.
It's a very distinct noise. And I'm glad that I'm experiencing it, because it only happens once, not even every decade.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're experiencing it now, you're kind of experiencing something that you may only get a chance to be around a few times in your lifetime.
Yeah, it's definitely a notable event for sure.
And not only is it notable for us, so the cicada emergence, obviously, you mentioned that they're making a mating call. So when they emerge, their only purpose in life really is just to find another cicada and make other cicadas.
Yep.
So after that happens, all these living cicadas that are buzzing around suddenly transform into something else entirely. So talk about the role that they play as a food source.
So cicadas are a pretty important food source to animals down here, especially in the eastern half of the United States when they come out, just because they are such an abundant food source at the time. Animals will experience baby booms for a few years after the fact. That's been recorded in birds, for example. Animals that don't normally go for insects will deliberately go for the cicadas just because they're so common and so easy to catch. I actually made a mistake a couple of weeks ago when I was on a morning radio show where I said copperheads don't eat cicadas because that sounded really suspicious. But I was talking with somebody else later and they said, well, it does sound suspicious because copperheads don't normally eat insects, but if they encounter a cicada, they'll eat it just because there are just so many of them.
It's an easy meal.
Exactly. You don't have to worry about catching it. They're usually right there on the ground, or they just emerged and they're climbing up the tree. So all you really have to do is wait and strike, and a lot of animals are taking advantage of that right now.
Yeah, we got distracted actually during a meeting earlier this week when it feels like the emergence sort of happened in waves. And so the emergence kind of hit downtown this week, and we could watch from our conference room birds just taking them out in the sky, which was really cool to watch. And it really kind of speaks to the role that these insects play in supplying the food web. I didn't know that about the baby boom. That's fascinating.
So according to somebody who knows a lot more about birds than me, the yellow-billed cuckoo is a species that will have more broods and will breed and have kind of a major baby boom immediately after a cicada emergence, just because that is such a good, high quality and easy to catch meal for them that they don't really have to even expend any extra energy in order to eat.
Which is great. I mean, if you're a yellow-billed cuckoo.
Yes, yellow-billed cuckoo, it looks like.
If you're hesitant to eat insects, there are things to know about insects that may make them, if not necessarily more palatable, at least you might understand why they are so commonly eaten around the world. So looking this up, the nutritional value of insects can actually be pretty comparable to some of the meat sources that we do rely on. So things like pork and chicken and beef. 100-gram serving of beef has 200 calories and 19 to 26 grams of protein. A 100-gram serving of crickets is 120 calories, so about 80 calories less than beef, but it has a surprisingly high amount of protein, 8 to 25 grams of protein. So if you remember, 26 grams was the upper limit of beef, 25 is the upper limit of crickets. That's pretty comparable.
Yeah, that's pretty good just generally for a protein source.
And as you've mentioned, so the cicada emergence, obviously it's called a brood because it is a massive number of insects emerging all at once. But I mean, insects just in general, I mean, a lot of insects do exist in amounts like this. I mean, that's why they call them locust swarms.
Yes. Yeah. And even like mayflies, which we also get around here in our streams, they will also come out in massive numbers at once. And it's for that exact reason. They are a really good, really, as far as energy is considered, cheap food source, meaning that you don't have to expend a lot of energy to go find it. And everybody likes an easy meal. So it's generally helpful for everybody to emerge at once, because then there's some guarantee that at least somebody is going to survive long enough to breed and pass on their genetic material.
Now you kind of think about the culling that happens when sea turtles emerge. So from their nests in such large numbers, and we've all probably watched nature documentaries that have sea turtles breaking for the waves and every predator under the sun trying to take them out. So yeah, if you have enough of them emerging all at once, the likelihood is that at least somebody's going to make it to the ocean, or in this case, make it to another cicada to breed.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking in general terms, since you do study insects on a global scale, how fundamental are they to food webs kind of around the world? Are they an important resource for a lot of different ecosystems in terms of being a food source for other animals?
They are nearly as central as plants are to a lot of animals, especially animals that need a little bit more protein. A lot of animals will have specific adaptations that they'll develop in order to just eat insects, just because they are such a common food source in most of the world. Something like, I want to say 40% of the Earth's biomass are arthropods, which is insects and their relatives. So it makes sense for animals to specialize to these sorts of things.
And arthropods would include things like
shrimp,
and
lobsters.
Lobster. So again, they're just sea bugs. So Rose, you mentioned that some animals have developed specific adaptations to help them be better at eating insects. So what are some examples of that?
So anteaters and a lot of animals that are developed to eat mostly ants, like the aardwolf as well, will lose teeth, develop more elongated snouts to get into the dirt where a lot of these insects are. The eye, for example, has a elongated finger that's meant to go into trees, I believe.
So that's a species of lemur.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Which means I don't know as much about it as one of our lemur people might know.
But they do have those creepy long fingers.
Yes, to go into trees and I believe eat beetle larvae that live in the stumps. So a lot of animals do that. A lot of animals do have various adaptations for eating insects. And a lot of them also have life history changes as well. They will have a population boom in years where there are large cicada emergences, such as a periodical cicada boom, and dial back in years when we only have like dog day cicadas, for example.
What we're experiencing now would be a periodical cicada boom.
Yes.
And the dog days would be more like an annual occurrence. It's just on a smaller scale.
Yeah. The dog day cicadas will be the cicadas you'll start hearing outside in the later part of the summer. August, that sort of thing. Those guys emerge on a 1 to 5 year life cycle, but they come out every single year. They don't have this massive emergence the same way our periodical cicadas do. So the population winds up leveling at a pretty steady amount throughout the year. And also the cicada killer wasp, surprising absolutely nobody from its name, has a massive population boom during years when we have periodical cicadas, because cicadas are the primary food that they feed their young. They actually paralyze them and put them in their dens where their larvae hatch and eat them.
Nature is grim.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely is, especially insects. Insects are hardcore.
So really, the fact that humans aren't, well, let me back up. The fact that those of us in the United States and Canada and other Western nations don't treat insects as a more common food source, or as you mentioned, a taboo, that makes us a little bit unusual as just a species.
It certainly does. Like, most animals will even make an exception for some insects. Like I mentioned, the copperheads and cicadas, just because it is an easy meal and nobody really ever turns down an easy meal when they can get one. We are unusual, but this also happens a lot with Western societies, where we see another culture eating this food, and at first we think, wow, that looks bad, that's weird. And then slowly over time, we get more exposed to it and we get more comfortable with it. And ultimately, we embrace it. And I would not be surprised if that happens here.
So recently, there was an interesting development at my house where we got a couple of suckers that had insects inside them. I don't know if you've seen these. So it's a lollipop, I guess, that is formed around an insect. And so my daughter, who I fully expected to go, ooh, that's gross, gleefully, ate this sucker that had some sort of insect on the inside of it. I can't remember what it was.
And kids can have pretty open minds, for sure.
So maybe you're right. Maybe in generations to come, you'll find, I don't know, chapulines on more menus outside of Mexican cuisine.
Possibly. Wouldn't be surprised.
So when you had your mealworm stir fry, do you remember how it was prepared, what was done to it?
So I have vague memories. This was a while back. But it was pretty much just fried in a pan with general kind of stir fry vegetables, and some soy sauce and rice was added, and it was pretty much identical to pork fried rice. The only difference was, instead of pork, it was mealworms.
The interesting thing, as I was sort of doing research for this episode, looking into kind of ways that we could potentially incorporate insects into our food in ways that are maybe a little more palatable, in that they are not so obviously an insect wrapped around, or insect inside of a sucker.
Yeah.
Is things like cricket flour.
Oh, yeah.
So ways that we can maybe there are ways we can process insects in such a way that they can lend that nutritional value to our diets without being so offensively in your face
about eating
being
an insect. Yeah.
So, I mean, would you try bread or a baked good that was made with cricket flour?
I think I have already. I don't really, in my mind, see that as eating an insect for that exact reason. Just like you mentioned, like, the insect isn't there. You can't see its little face looking at you or anything like that. But yes, now that I'm thinking about it, I have tried those protein flours that they sell. And then you look at the ingredients on the back and it's like cricket flour. I've tried that. And honestly, I don't think it's that much different than any other healthy health food type of thing.
If you don't know, it's more palatable, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
So, Rose, we've talked a lot about, this entire episode obviously is about eating insects, whether you're another animal or if you're a human in one of the cultures that does eat insects. But as an entomologist, you work with insects regularly. That is your job. You are over our butterfly garden and the Ocean Journey building. So you're, in that sense, I guess, more of a lepidopterist. But your actual title is entomologist. So we'll just assume then that you have some degree of fondness for insects. So how do you feel then about the idea of entomophagy? So using insects as a food source, does that bother you?
I mean,
and I don't mean on a personal level. I mean on a professional friend of insects level. Does it bother you?
On a friend of insects level, not really. Insects have notoriously short lifespans, and oftentimes the end game of these lifespans is to be eaten by another animal. So if you think of it as just a natural, normal process, I think it makes it easier to stomach for sure. I suppose my point is that it doesn't strike me as that much different than a lot of the animal agriculture we already have in the world. And regardless of how people feel about that, on some level it is even less ecologically damaging because you don't really have to clear cut a forest in order to graze a herd of crickets or anything like that.
And we spoke on another episode about in Madagascar, the reason that the bushmeat trade is affecting lemur species is because when you're in a situation where, as a human, you are impoverished and you have limited access to the foodstuffs that we in our culture are lucky enough to have access to, things that are nutrient rich like beef and chicken and pork, you eat what's available.
Exactly.
And when you're in a situation that you have to, you will do what you have to feed yourself and or your family.
Exactly, yeah.
So if you could instead grab a bucket of mealworms or a tray of fried grasshoppers, and
that's
get
probably
the same,
a better option, yeah.
Yeah, because grasshoppers exist in such profusion that they are, you're causing less damage to grasshoppers as a species than you would be to take a lemur, which is endangered. So it could be a solution to a lot of different problems.
Yep, absolutely. And I actually remember reading while I was preparing for this that some of the species that they used to make chapelinas, to bring it back around to the previous conversation, are invasive grasshoppers in Mexico. So in that way, it's kind of fixing two problems simultaneously because you can control these animals that are having a negative impact on our ecosystem while feeding people and keeping people from starving or having to do other desperate things in order to survive.
So the cicada emergence is likely to wrap up in a few weeks. And we're not going to experience this again for more than a decade. But to talk about what we've talked about in the last 20 minutes or so has really opened my eyes to the possibilities of what could happen in terms of opening up resources to us if we did overcome our aversion here in the West to eating insects and joined the 2 billion other people around the world who do regularly eat insects in Oceania, Africa, Latin America, South America. It would be interesting in years to come if we start to see things like Michelin star restaurants that have grasshopper biscuits, because it really would mark a sort of sea change for us as a culture and a broadening of our perception of the role that insects could play. It
happened with lobster, so
That's
future's
true.
wide open.
If lobster can do it,
yes,
surely then crickets can do it too.
Absolutely.
If you have a question for us here at the Podcast Aquatic that you would like us to pass on to one of our experts at the aquarium like Rose, be sure to send us an email to podcast@tnaqua.org. Rose, thanks so much.
You're welcome.